Chapter 14. A Child's Physical Pain and Terror. I have lived all my adult life alone as a social anorexic, and I have failed miserably at any attempted relationship with a woman. To revisit the physical pain and terror I experience so that I may make an attempt to draw closer to other human beings. My biological father was a monster. If I didn't scream loud enough, the physical pain intensified from being slapped harder in the face and on the side of my head, and on the side of the head. The monster's rage and manic frenzy at me not reacting in a shameful way to his power and dominance were never ending. As a child, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, I had no outs for 200 days of the year. The monster was my whole universe. I was helpless and powerless at the hands of a torturer, one of the worst of men. He had his way with me. The monster's madness became my forced reality. His narrative doesn't need to be told by me here to have a better understanding of him and why he behaved the way he did. What is important to me is that I feel good for others. For monsters, it is best that I leave the telling of their narratives to others who say that monsters need to be understood so that they might be mentally and emotionally treated and thereby be prevented or persuaded not to act out in evil ways towards other helpless victims. I, I screamed and cried from the age of 4 through the age of 17. That terror I felt was from the physical pain I experienced from the torture, rapidly slapping me all over my face and along the side of my head. When I became a teenager, I felt and thought intuitively he was searching for nerve endings to strike on my face. Like a sadistic musician playing high notes on his instrument, he wanted to make me scream all the more louder. I was terrified he would lose control and disfigure me by smashing the bones in my face. Of what hope would I ever have of living out my youthful aspirations in my adult life? I tried desperately with all my might to hold on to what degree of humanness I possessed. It was the part of me that cared for other people, along with the fragment of my imagination that dreamed of living a life other than the one I had. What is important to me is that other victims' narratives need to be told. Their perspective, their experiences should be shared, listened to, and felt. To honor them by being attentive and open to absorbing their shared inner life experiences, to let their spirit, their soul be alive within me, even if only momentarily, for their memories to be a portion of a living stream of consciousness. My hope is to reflect the triumph of light and good over evil. The narratives that shortly follow this one are my choice, my attempt to feel for others, to be open with the thoughtful consideration to spend the time of my day in inhabiting another's recollections of what affected them in an extreme, detrimental, ill way, to depict their heroic struggle to overcome this inner blight, to uncover, to reclaim the miracle of inner being and inner creation that dwells within each of them as a living soul and an innermost being of thought and feeling. They are of value. Their lives have merit and are worth living, and so choose. That the insight and experience of inner beauty not be denied to them. That it is a part of their heritage and the essence of their innermost being in an incredibly wonderful, miraculous way. That is their whole world, not the insidious one that was inflicted upon them. The plight of my youngest brother Jack. When I think of my youngest brother Jack, I hope to experience an inner courage to imagine what his plight and suffering might have been like during his life. From an early age, 11, when he would attempt to talk, the left side of his face would begin to twitch and convulse. My mother told me that he was held up to ridicule and considered freakish and then abandoned by his boyhood friends. He withdrew from his schoolmates and began to live his life alone. He would seldom attempt to speak to anyone. With the passing of time and the continued twitching and involuntary convulsing of the left side of his face, he became disfigured with a growth of a golf ball sized cyst on his cheek. Though he tried working a number of jobs such as dishwasher and truck driver, he was unable to hold on to a steady employment. When my brother Jim went over to visit my parents several years later on the north side of Pittsburgh, he was approached by a guy who was a neighbor. He knew Jack by sight, and that at times during the day Jack would leave my parents' house and go out for lengthy walks. One of the times he fell prey to a group of several male teenagers who stopped and then surrounded him on his walk. They were ridiculing him and making it seem like he was a bad guy who deserves a beating from them. This neighbor saw what was happening and he went right up to all of them. He confronted them. He put a halt to what they were about to do to Jack. He told them my younger brother had a no fault disability that isolated and prevented him from interacting with other people. He said my brother's privacy and person should be respected and he should be left alone when he took walks. The teenagers listened to what he told them and they went on their way without further incident. When my brother Jim told me this, I felt a debt of gratitude towards this anonymous neighbor. He behaved in such a heroic way towards these teenagers and prevented harm from being done to my youngest brother. My heart went out to Jack. I felt compassion, empathy, and care towards him. I was profoundly saddened that he had such a life experience. I asked Jack a year ago if he went out for daily walks in the western city where he now lives. He told me no. When I encouraged him to resume his walking, he told me that he didn't feel safe when he was outside of his apartment in public. I can imagine that at different times during his life, he has fallen victim to other guys who have either tried to rob him or have belittled him for sport. Such seems to be the way of the male world when you are deemed to be a painted bird, someone who is to be singled out and attacked because of your physical appearance or because you are helpless and unable to fight and defend yourself against any of their barbs or taunts. During the past several years, my brother has been on psychiatric medication. It has permitted him to speak at intervals with no more than a short sentence. Though it isn't enough to carry on a conversation with anyone, it is better than him not being able to speak at all. I draw inspiration and inner strength from thinking of him. He is and has been a good man. There isn't an enacted craziness or insanity about any of his outward behaviors, in spite of his life's experiences. There is a dignity that he has maintained throughout his adult life. He doesn't see his cup as half empty, but more so as half full, like I do. He watches a lot of TV. I remind myself that a higher good of virtue and thought, that a higher good and virtue of thought, feeling, and inner being matter the most in this world for myself and probably also for my youngest brother. I can always benefit by being open to others' inspirations, life experiences, and examples. Forgiveness along with the rejection of evil. I have forgiven my mother for the most part. I have always seen her as a victim of my father. When she married him and began to have children by him, I don't believe she had the imagination to think of the monster that he would be towards them. I believe she was a very conflicted woman regarding my father. He never cursed or beat her, but his psychotic rage and premeditated behaviors towards his sons had to give had to have given her cause to be terrified of him and to question whether he would at a time in the future begin to curse, hate, and beat her. He never did to her what he did to their children. He may not have physically harmed my mother, but he held her hostage to his evil. She was a beautiful woman. With her consent, she belonged to him and was his partner in life. Whatever there was of a living soul within her, I believe she lost a large portion of it to my father in a way that was detrimental to her spiritual being. I believe that because of her own inner stress and fear of what my father might do to her one day, spiritually, a large part of her imploded within. She gave a part of her soul and being over to my father and became a shell of the woman and loving mother that she could have been. Above all else, though she passed away 10 years ago, I feel compassion and care for her. I hope that wherever she is at, things are going well for her. I am thankful towards her for the good that she did by me as my mother. For the rest of it, I prefer to let bygones be bygones. Throughout my adult life, going back 30 years to the beginning of my recovery, the act of forgiveness by many has always been presented to me as an act of virtue and one of a higher good. Perhaps as a result, I have seen at times my reluctance and unwillingness to forgive my father as a personal failing and shortcoming. The spiritual awareness I've gained with the passing of time and willful effort on my part is that I can't forgive my father. It seems and feels intuitively morally wrong on my part to attempt to do so. I don't want to honor him either as a person or as a human being. I can't let bygones be bygones. I still feel the humiliation, trauma, and pain of what he did to me. I still feel the shame of my behavior, of what I felt I had to do back then in order for him not to hurt or harm me further. The only time I didn't scream, cry for my life, and flop around on the floor was the very first time he touched me. I still remember At the age of 4, the flying sensation as I flew through the air when he held me up over his head and hurled me across the room. I bounced off of the floor and hit my head against the edges of the square wooden table leg. I remember the wetness and the blood streaming down the side of my face onto my shirt. I didn't cry. I didn't shame myself. That was the only time when I didn't. I can't help but feel it wasn't seemed that it hasn't seemed morally right to me in my adult life that I forgive my father for his reprehensible behavior towards me. I ask myself why, and it is because of several reasons. One of which is that his conduct towards me was one of premeditated and deliberate harm. I remember as a teenager, age 14, when I said to him, "Dad, when you hit me, you really hurt me. Would you please stop?" He burst out loud, laughing like what I had just said was the funniest thing he had ever heard. A year later, when I was in the 10th grade, I sat across the dinner table from him as he explained to me that the high school principal had stopped by earlier in the day. Though my father wasn't there, he told me that the principal had told my mother that I had won $100 gambling by betting a football ticket by correctly picking 10 winning teams. The principal wanted to know the nickname of the kid who sold me the football ticket so that he would be able to stop whatever gambling was going on by the kids in school. When my father said to me, "Do you know what I'm going to do to you if you don't give me that kid's name?" he couldn't hide his delight at my predicament. I will never forget the look of lust with which he looked upon me. There was no disguising it. His premeditated thought and intention of breaking and shaming me in an irreparable way. Though his evil may have triumphed over me that evening, there has never been any justifiable reason for me to ever behave in such a way at any time towards any one of my fellow man or woman. It has always been intolerable for me to be like him. I knew his evil for what it was, the infliction of shame, pain, degradation, and irreparable damage. Such was not a path of living life that I chose to practice for myself. Evil was a descriptive word used often by both my mother and father towards me. I rejected it out of hand. There was nothing that I was doing that was evil towards either of them or anyone else. What my father was about in the treatment of me and his behavior towards me, either as a young child or in later years when I was a teenager, was morally wrong on his part. Sadism is defined in Webster's New World Dictionary as the getting of pleasure from mistreating others. My father was much more beyond this. The only resistance or act of defiance and protest that I could offer against him was not doing what he would tell me to do. For him, this resistance and defiance on my part were open invitations, considered so by him, to beat me all the more unmercifully, and he did. Yet I had to do something to resist and defy him for my sake. I felt compelled to reject him, and whatever he was about. This was what I did more often than not. There were many times, out of the blue, he would start cursing me for no reason at all and then begin slapping and hitting me. The few times he was left alone with me when I was a young child, he would sit in the same room, being rock solid, still like a lizard. When I would be playing, he would be turned towards me and just stare and glare at me unblinkingly without moving a muscle. Even back then, I wondered what was wrong with him. I still remember the last 2 years, age 16 and 17. I lived in his household. I went to great lengths to avoid him by not being home when he was there. I would be out in the streets. Still, he found the time to go out of his way to ambush me when I would be back in the house. He would straddle my chest, kneeling upon my arms. He would be hitting the side of my head and face immediately, cursing and laughing at me. At times he would be holding both his hands up in the air, demanding that I guess which hand he was going to slap or hit me with. He would say tauntingly, "I'm going to get you when you least expect it." Other times he would run the palm of his hand over my face in between pinching my nostrils shut and cupping my jaw with the heel of his palm, pushing upwards with it, trying to close my mouth so I wouldn't be able to scream, unless the family was on vacation. Then once a week he beat me. He never missed a week of a, he never missed a week or beating. With the passing of years in my adult life, there was never a shred of remorse or regret on his part towards me for his behavior. I can't think of a more inappropriate action on my part than to forgive him. During my adult life, I always kept my distance from him, living in other cities and states other than Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. During my childhood and as a teenager, I knew him as a torturer. What inner strength I may have possessed while I was in high school, I used to force myself to hate him and what he was doing to me. I knew intuitively that irreparable harm was being done to me. What has been most important at any time in living my life, either as a child, teenager, or an adult, has been not to do to others what was being done to me. Such was and is the beginning of a cornerstone to my own spirituality. I want to be connected to other people in a healthy, constructive way, of a higher good through both friendship and acquaintanceship. It is not up to me to forgive my father's evil. What is up to me is not to do or be evil myself and to make a willful, creative effort to be a good man and human being while I am here on this planet. My father is not worthy of my thought. Mental illness. When I was in the psychiatric wards in San Francisco for 4 times for a total of about 40 days in 1988, I was diagnosed with suicidal idealization along with a dissociative disorder. Though not as often as in the past, nevertheless, I still experience thoughts of wishing I was dead. I don't have any intention of acting on such thoughts because I want to honor and be worthy of the respect of the professionals in the mental health field who helped me out. I know that in comparison to many others who have suffered at the hands of someone who did deliberate harm to them, that I have had many good or positive constructive life experiences. I have not only persevered through or survived that what was done to me, but in many instances during my adult life I have thrived. I think also, without being aware of it, that throughout my adult life, including today, I have had or still experience other undiagnosed grave emotional and mental disorders, perhaps a lesser form of schizophrenia, along with visual hallucinations. When I have been with and around others, I have concealed these disorders by either being silent or not being responsive to my outward environment. Today, I tell myself to make a willful effort, followed hopefully by willful spirit and inspiration, to aspire and strive to be both inwardly and outwardly in a way of a higher good, and of trying to brighten an inner light that I think resides somewhere within a living soul inside me. Chapter 15, My Brother Jim's Narrative. Though the spankings and beatings that befell one of my brothers, Jim, who was 4 years younger than me, were less often, nevertheless, the trauma that impacted him was as severe as my own. From an early age on, his father set out to crush the miracle of being and of inner creation that was within him. Any kind of emotional warmth or kinship from either of his parents was denied to him. Even when he played at the age of 5 with a teddy bear named Biggie, it was not safe for him. His father, overhearing the make-believe conversation and friendship being exchanged between him and the bear, and his younger brother Jack, age 3, became upset and agitated. With a heavy-handed, critical comment directed towards Jim, he demanded that the make-believe conversation and play stop. Any sort of childlike talk and play around him weren't going to be tolerated. Physical affection was unknown and alien to Jim from his mother. This carried over into his relationship with his grandmother. At an early age, she tried to embrace him and to give him a hug. He wouldn't allow her touching. He rejected it. It made him feel extremely uncomfortable and anxious. It was Christmas Day. It was the highlight of the year. Jim's birthday was the day after Christmas. He had been looking forward to these 2 days for many a month. It was a beautiful time of the year for Jim. He was 6. He had told his mother and Santa Claus that what he wanted most for Christmas was a small toy rifle that was being advertised in the stores. When he didn't find it among his Christmas presents, he felt disappointed. We had lunch, and while we sat around the table, our mother made a comment that he didn't seem to be happy. He told her it was because he didn't receive a toy rifle as one of his Christmas presents. After lunch, he went back into the living room to play with the Christmas toys he had been given. He wasn't aware that his parents had planned on giving him the toy rifle the following day on his birthday. His mother must have prompted his father to give him the toy rifle that day instead of waiting for his birthday the next day. His father usually kept the Christmas and birthday presents hidden in the trunk of his car. He went outside to retrieve the toy rifle from his car trunk. From the moment he came back into the household, his father went ballistic. He was in a rage, hollering that the toy rifle was supposed to be held back from Jim on Christmas so he could receive it the next day on his birthday. As he came into the living room, he loudly proclaimed his displeasure and feeling of resentment at how wrong this was. Him having to be made to give Jim the toy rifle that day. His anger and spite that this was all him being offended hovered over the living room, despite the sparkling brightness of the Christmas lights wrapped around the family's holiday tree. Whatever happiness and joy of spirit that a young child might experience on such a magical day was ruined and gone by the wayside. Jim felt dejected and despondent of all his Christmas days. That is the one he chooses to try to remember the least, yet usually ends up remembering the most. When Jim was in the second grade, he would walk to school with one of the neighbor kids and the younger brother who was in the first grade. One of the mornings on the way to school, Jim was suddenly overcome with an unexplained involuntary rage. He wanted to start pounding this younger brother, his school friend, senseless. He told this to his friend. He asked him to hold his books while he beat up his younger brother. His friend told him no, and that he wasn't allowed to do this. Jim's ire vanished just as quickly as it had come upon him. He never again felt any inclination to behave in such a way towards anyone who was smaller than him. Perhaps this was the beginning to acquire an inner strength that he would exhibit as a young adult several years on down the line. When Jim was in the fourth grade, an older boy approached him and told him that he wanted Jim to beat up a smaller younger kid whom the two of them knew. Jim didn't say anything to the older boy. He ignored him and he never assaulted the smaller younger boy. When he was 8 or 9, he was playing with his toys and he muttered the word ship. His father was nearby and yelled at him, "You said shit." He quickly strode over to Jim and started hitting and slapping him, screaming at him, "You said shit, probably." When Jim was being beaten from the age of 10 through 12, his mother on occasion would be shrieking at his father all the while during the beating. All of them are going to grow up to hate you. Going to Catholic grade school was a living nightmare for Jim. His mother had been pushed by the nuns to enter Jim in the first grade, a year ahead of other children who were his age. He had a difficult time keeping up his school grades with his peers, as it was, but with the physical beatings, hatred, and curses that were directed at him by his father, he couldn't concentrate long enough on his school studies to do well in any one of them. He had a constant fear of failing or doing poorly at school. He felt the nuns would begin to punish him by hitting him on his hands with a ruler, or worse, they would commence to paddle him. His mother spoke to him about wanting him to repeat a grade. She said she was going to send him to the town of Indiana, approximately 100 miles outside of Pittsburgh, to live with some of the relatives and their families. She said he would be better off going to a school where no one knew anything about him. Though she spoke of this to him, she never followed through on it. Instead, it was his lot that he remain in our father's family household and continue to be a whipping post for his rage and hatred. A turning point in Jim's life was when he was in the sixth grade. He was introduced to the Boy Scouts. Within a short passing of time, he learned and began practicing camping skills, crafts, going on hikes, sharpening a knife, and being active in the outdoors. Most of all, he experienced the good fortune of being with and around other adult males who put forth an example for him of other guys having and practicing a moral code of conduct in a way of a higher good towards young people. They were role models. He looked up to them and felt respect towards them, not fear. They imparted an inspiration and a life experience to Jim that moral values were both meaningful and important to acquire in trying to make a go out of living life in a positive and constructive way. He went on to become a high school explorer in the Boy Scouts. The benefits of Jim of being in the Scouts were immeasurable and profound. When Jim was 11 or 12, during his school summer vacation, he did stay with his grandmother in Indiana. He was in the older part of the city where some of the trees' roots grew underneath the concrete on the sidewalks. There were deep cracks and lumps on and beneath the surface of many of them. He was tacking he was taking a stroll with his grandmother, and in addition to the cracks and lumps on the sidewalk that they were walking upon, there were also small potholes where you had to watch your step. His grandmother, fearful of tripping or falling, reached out her hand to hold onto his arm. He instinctively recoiled out of fear, yanking his arm back. Emotions and physical touching were traumatic to him in a frightening way. He couldn't allow anyone to get close to him because then they couldn't hurt him. He couldn't afford displays of physical or emotional affection towards him. Outwardly, he had to be tough and strong. Vulnerability and sensitivity were weaknesses to be shunned. With the exception of a brief platonic fling with a pretty girl in the 11th grade, Jim didn't have a capability or a willingness to relate and interact with girls when he was in high school. He experienced an inexplicable fear of emotional intimacy. Getting beat up, cursed at, and hated by his father took everything from within Jim for him to persevere through the shame, humiliation, degradation, and evil his father was trying to afflict and torment him with. His father was both a curse and a plague. When Jim was a senior in high school, both of his older brothers had already moved out of the household. He moved on he moved into the attic and made it his room. He painted the walls pitch black and used psychedelic colors and various decorations throughout the room to express his inner inclination to explore spirituality by expanding his consciousness. There was a small window in the attic that looked out into the driveway where his father would park his car after he got home from work. At times, Jim would hear the car pulling into the driveway. He would walk to the window and look down upon his father walking to the back kitchen entrance of the house. Jim would raise his hands and arms, pretending he was a sniper and assassin holding a rifle. He would take careful aim and then pull the trigger and splat. His father's head would explode from the impact of the bullet. Embellishing his room in pitch black along with psychedelic colors and pretending to be an assassin of his father were two of the ways Jim sought to combat the evil and wickedness of his father. His father continued preying upon him when he least expected it, and then physically assaulting him. The last time was a couple of weeks before he was due to graduate from high school. Afterwards, on Saturday, he gathered his belongings and went over to his friend's apartment on the north side of town. After staying there for 5 days, he rented a room near the high school and dairy store that he worked at as a cashier. He went back to school, his face still black and blue and bruised. One of his schoolmates said to him, "What happened to you?" Jim replied, "I got beat up by the old man." During the next several days, both friends and acquaintances would inquire of him what happened, though those who knew him well didn't need to ask. A week later, his mother came into the dairy store when he was working. She sought conversation with him. He ignored her. It was 1969. He had graduated from high school. He was 17. The Vietnam War was raging on. Jim was in the process of leaving the household for a month-long trip to travel by bus to Washington, D.C. to protest in a march and rally against the war. The trip included a 2-week stay over in North Carolina to attend a conference to train to be a nonviolent activist. As he was walking out the kitchen door, his mother stopped him and asked him for a kiss goodbye. He gave her a light kiss on her cheek. Later on the road in the bus, he was gazing out one of the windows at the passing landscapes. He felt compelled to look inward, and the question that came to him was, how can I preach peace and love when I don't even love my own mother? From 18 till Jim's early 20s, he smoked a lot of pot and took LSD to kill the pain, torment, and trauma he still experienced. Yet he drew inspirations from his two closest friends in relating to others and in learning about the capacity to love when both of them had babies and their girlfriends around the same time. His girlfriend of 3 or 4 months would tell him that he was a closed book. She said he did not communicate anything of substance to her. He didn't know what she meant by that. There was nothing positive or constructive he could say to her about his family life or his emotions and feelings. The best he could do in being with her was to be silent, yet to continue to possess a liking and a respect for her. He battled against the intoxication, dominance, and overwhelming power of feeling hate within his living soul. A dark, hidden shadow his every footstep, dogged his every footstep in his early adult life. When he was 21 and tripping on LSD, he was with a friend who was talking at length and depth about making choices between love and hate and between life and death. The soliloquy spoken by his friend triggered feelings and thoughts where he started to fantasize about going over to his parents' house and killing both of them. While he contemplated such an act, a turning point in his life came up upon him while he was unaware. A choice was presented to him within. He chose love and life over hate and spiritual death. He then felt exuberated beyond his wildest imaginings. He immediately left his friend and went across town to see his girlfriend. He proposed marriage to her. She saw he was on LSD. She showed him the door. She ended the relationship shortly thereafter. It was 1974. Jim was 22. A friend of one of his friends was a narc and informant for the police regarding the use and sale of marijuana. Their house was raided by the police, and Jim was arrested along with several of his friends. They were locked up in the Allegheny County Jail. One of his friends, without him being aware of it, called up his mother with the intention that she would post the bail money to get him released on his own recognizance. She came down to the jail and she told Jim that she would speak to his father about getting the bail money for him. Jim had had very little contact with his mother the previous 2 years, and he didn't want any with her at that time. He didn't want to see either his mother or his father, yet he found himself reluctantly agreeing to meet the two of them a week later. His friend had already posted bail for him. Jim didn't want to want his house address known to his parents. He had them pick him up in their car from a street corner in Oakland, on the other side of town from where they lived. When they came, he sat in the back seat. His father was driving. His father said, rather you have I would rather have you come home from Vietnam in a box than have you get arrested for drugs because this is a complete disgrace." Jim was silent. He wearily thought, "What a hypocrite! Him acting like he is this great man of respect and integrity due him." What came to Jim was all the hateful, spiteful names and obscenities his father used to call him while he beat him from his early childhood on. He felt a rush of hatred and aggression towards his father and instantly regretted agreeing to the visit with his parents. He wished it was over even before it began. He glanced at his mother. She was quiet, accepting what his father had said without protest or argument. It was just like he was still under their roof. Everything was still the same and unchanged. He felt a heavy weight of depression and unhappiness. Every several months, he began to visit his mother and father to have dinner with them. The turmoil in his stomach, the feeling of hate, and still feeling obligated to visit them overpowered him. He couldn't deal with the conflict and agitation. He felt crazy. Each time before he went over to their place, he would smoke some marijuana. Once there, he would have a couple of beers along with the dinner. Afterwards, he would excuse himself to leave. Every time he would go back to his apartment and rush into the bathroom, he would stick his head over the toilet bowl and vomit until his stomach ached and was empty. He felt physically drained. He was exhausted emotionally. He didn't understand why he kept going over there in the first place. With the passing of time, Jim's inner experiences of seeking spirit and light became defining and waking moments for him in his adult life. The decision, the choice, and the beginning of fulfillment and commitment were made to travel along a road other than the one he had been traveling upon. A spiritual adventure and journey of discovery and of discovery had commenced. It was following a path of a guiding inner light along with the inspiration to love and to attain a well-being of spirit to share and to experience with his fellow man and woman. Chapter 16. Layla's Narrative. Layla is a 33-year-old woman who was born in California. Her first memory of her family was that they were very nice. She was 3 years old at the time. Her family was her mother, father, 3 brothers, and 3 sisters. She was the youngest. Most of all, she remembers her hero and stepbrother, Mike, who was 6 years older than her. He was a smoker. When she was 6 and he was 12, she tried to get him to stop smoking. She had heard that cigarettes kill you. She feared for her brother's life. He wouldn't stop, so because she cared about him and felt anguish, she went to her mother for aid. He still wouldn't stop. After 2 years, when Mike was 14, he was given a choice by Layla's mother. If he wouldn't quit smoking, then he had to leave and go live with his biological mother. He chose to leave. Layla was devastated. Mike was her hero. She felt he had chosen cigarettes. and his addiction to them over being with her and a good family. She felt abandoned at age 8 by him. Layla's parents were economically wealthy. They would be home with Layla for up to 4 months at a time, and then they would go away on vacations by themselves for 1 week or up until 6 months at a time. When Layla was 2 or 3 years old, she was introduced to an inner reality of fear and terror. She kept this a guarded secret from others. She thought that stealers were going to get her and that she would be kidnapped and taken away. From age 2 through 16, she slept only 2 or 3 hours a night, no more. The threat and fright dominated her life. She felt compelled and driven to protect herself. Each of the upstairs bedrooms had a rope ladder in it, in case of a fire or emergency. The family was prepared. Each family member practiced at various times unfurling the rope ladder down to the ground from their bedroom window and climbing down. Every night, Layla took the rope ladder out from under her bed and unfurled it down her second-story window. She had to be ready to act if the stealers came for her. She prepared an escape route for herself. Sometimes she would climb to the ground after bedtime and play flashlight tag with Mike, her hero. Every one of her 6 brothers and sisters and her 2 parents were either alcoholics or drug addicts. Later in her life, Layla became one herself. Between her first and second year, her older sister, age 30, was asked to watch and babysit Layla for 3 days. Her parents were out of town. Layla's older sister stole all of her mom's fur coats and jewelry that were in the house. Her parents were incredibly wealthy. The sister was a drug addict and user at the time. She cast aside Layla. Layla didn't eat for 3 days, and the sister didn't change her diaper either. This was the first time that someone treated Layla in an ill way. Layla would play with her older brother Mike when she was 4 to 6. She would jump up and down on the bed, and when she was up in the air, Mike would grab her and then throw her up against the wall. Regardless, he still remained Layla's hero. Mike and her older male cousin by 8 years, Cedric, would force her to watch scary movies like the Chucky doll movies where he would kill a lot of people in the movie. Layla was 6 to 8 at the time. Mike was 12 to 14, and Cedric was 14 to 16 years of age when this occurred. Layla was petrified watching any one of these horror movies. She kept her eyes tightly shut. She couldn't mentally process the physical torture and savagery that were in these movies, and that it was fiction, not reality, that she was seeing. The only saving grace for her was that she got to be with Mike, whom she adored. The boys began to tape Layla's eyelids open so she couldn't shut her eyes while they constrained her to a chair to force her to look at these movies. They would tie her arms to the chair so she couldn't move. They would be laughing while she screamed during the showing of the movie. When one of the Chucky movies would be shown, they would slyly go behind her back and take one of her dolls. They would cut off the doll's hair and clothes to resemble Chucky, and then tuck the doll in Layla's bed underneath the covers without her being aware of what they did. She would at times wake up in the middle of the night discovering this doll in her bed. She would silently scream with fright inside of herself, scared out of her wits, but she wouldn't tell her parents because she didn't want to get her brother Mike into trouble. Scaring and spooking Layla Whenever these two boys got together, went on for sometimes 3 times a week during a period of 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, Mike, 14, chose to move out of the household permanently into his biological mother's house because he refused to stop smoking and drinking alcohol. Without her brother there to be her friend, Layla felt horribly lonely and abandoned. Cedric, her cousin, aged 16, stopped coming over to visit. He lived with his and Layla's grandmother. Because her parents were wealthy and didn't have to work, they could afford to go on extended trips and vacations for a couple of days on up to a couple months. They wouldn't take Layla, therefore she would stay at her grandmother's while her parents were away. She would be left alone with her cousin. Cedric was a monster. He was cunning, premeditated, and evil. He stole and raped Layla's childhood. She was 8 when it began. Cedric said to her initially when he was alone with her, "Layla, do you want to know what you do to your friend and also to make other people really like you?" Layla replied, "Of course, I want to know. All you need to do is play puppy with people. Do you want to know how?" Layla said, "Yeah," Cedric answered. "What puppies do when they like someone is that they lick them." He began to groom Layla at first by having her lick his face and neck, and then he would do the same to her. After the first 2 days of doing this, he said to her, "Now, when the puppies are really good friends, you do something different. They clean each other." He made it sound like to Layla that he thought it was her suggestion that they lick each other. He then told Layla that they were supposed to clean each other by licking each other's butts. This became an everyday occurrence when Layla was with him at their grandmother's. It would become more sexually progressive and explicit than it was the time before. The grandmother represented herself to Layla as being religious. Layla, age 8, told her that Cedric was forcibly compelling her to do every day with and to him. Her grandmother immediately whipped her behind with a paddle until Layla had welts there. The grandmother demanded that Layla admit to lying about Cedric, until Layla said, "Grandma, I'm sorry, I was lying. Cedric never touched me." She wouldn't receive any meals prepared by her grandmother for her. Layla would then eat mostly saltine crackers. Usually it was for only a day, but sometimes it was for several days. Also, her grandmother would stop talking to Layla altogether. From the beatings, the pain, shame, humiliation, and Layla's tears were too much for her to overcome. She was helpless to pray to both Cedric's and her grandmother's power and dominance over her. Layla was beat several more times by her grandmother because Layla kept telling her over and over what Cedric was doing to her and what was happening. Finally, Layla stopped telling her grandmother anything and would lie to her, saying that nothing was going on with Cedric. Layla was terrified of being hit and being shamed and humiliated further by her grandmother. The grandmother chose not to believe her, to Layla's detriment. Cedric's brutal violations of Layla, along with his calculated malice were relentless. When Layla was home with her mother, Layla would question her while the rapes and violations were going on and even after they stopped. "Mom, do you and Dad play puppy?" Layla would say to her repeatedly. "Do you play puppy?" Words failed Layla. Her mother would reply no, or just laugh aloud and ignore her. She never inquired of Layla what she meant by these questions. In Layla's school classes during this time, she was considered weird by her schoolmates. She would sing loudly in the hallways between classes. The singing helped her to drown out all the anxiety and disgust she felt about herself at times, whether it was in her early or late childhood or still even today. Layla would walk up to girls her age in elementary school and hug them. For her, it was about trying to show love for her schoolmates. It also helped her not to feel so terrible about herself. Yet the other girls were uncomfortable with the hugging. After she was sexually molested and violated by Cedric, he then began raping her when she was still 8 years old. He raped Layla at least 20 times when she was 8 and 9. A direct result of this is that Layla's genital area inside suffered severe, irreparable damage. As recently as 3 months ago, she had another of several surgeries to try to fix the harm and damage that was done to her uterus. The surgery was unsuccessful, and a hysterectomy was required and performed. When Layla was 10, she gathered up all the courage she could. She called and told her mom, who was on vacation, that there were problems at grandma's, and she didn't want to be or go there anymore. Her mother said, "Wait 3 weeks until I get back from my vacation, and then we will talk about it." For those 3 weeks over at Grandma's, whenever Cedric would come back from school, Layla would leave the household and go outside to escape from him. She had been told by Cedric that if you inhale deeply from a cigarette, your brain would experience a rush and you would feel better. Layla began to pick up cigarette butts that were discarded on the sidewalk or in the gutter and put them in a makeshift pocket in her sweatshirt. She would then find a safe place, hidden from people's sight, where no one could see her. She would then smoke all the cigarette butts consecutively, one right after the other. She usually managed 2 or 3 puffs from each butt. Layla was looking for some kind of reprieve from the living nightmare she was being forced to experience at the hands of Cedric. It was like she was stuck in an unending horror movie where every day she would be preyed and set upon by a dark creature or the night who would do horrific, disgusting things to her and debase her over and over. When Layla was 11 and 12, she didn't have to go over to her grandma's anymore. At 12, she told Mike, her brother, that what Cedric did to her. Mike, 18 at that time, told her mother. In the end, he was a genuine hero for Layla. Her family moved from California to Reno, Nevada when Layla was 13. She was a freshman at high school. She was scholastically gifted and that she had been able to skip a grade. She would go to parties where she regularly did a lot of hallucinogenic drugs. She also did them when she was at school. She wanted to do what she had to do to be anyone but her. The worst of Layla's life experiences occurred when she was 14. She went to a party where most of the people there were 18 and older. She had to urinate. She went into the bathroom. There was an older man, late 20s, hiding behind the door. He suddenly slammed the door shut. Layla was stunned. She felt helpless. The man had a boombox there and turned on the music really loud. It was deafening. Everything happened so quickly. Layla was in a state of shock and fright. She felt paralyzed. The man began to tear off her clothes. Layla began screaming at him and to stop and not to do this to her. The boombox drowned out her screams. She was crying. She was fearful that he was going to rape or kill her. She pleaded with him. She was on her menses period and using a tampon. He said okay, giving Layla a brief moment of hope that he was not going to do this. Then he said, "Good thing there are two holes." He laughed malevolently, looking at Layla. She was still crying. He raped her from behind and then just left her naked, shattered and broken on the bathroom floor. Layla went in search of her boyfriend Sean. She found him in a room engaging sexually with another woman. Layla was still naked. Her body was numb. Her mental and emotional states were frozen from shock and fright. She just wanted her purse, but in the room with him and the other girl. She went over to the bed and grabbed her purse off of the floor. Her boyfriend and the girl he was with went berserk. In an immense rage, the two of them chased Layla, weeping and naked, out of the house into the street. They began beating her. The girl ripped out chunks of Layla's hair, repeatedly punching her in the face, giving her two black eyes and a broken nose. They knocked Layla out cold onto the pavement. Afterwards, they just left her naked, beat, and torn up out in the street. She went from being in one living nightmare of horror into another. Layla has been inspired and helped out within by several people in trying to brighten her own inner light into one of inner beauty and love. From kindergarten through third grade, Layla was fortunate enough to have the same teacher from kindergarten through third grade. Layla felt that this lady teacher saw potential in her. Teacher D made the classroom environment into a safe haven for herself and other students. Teacher D was there to protect her and others from harm. At times, Layla was overtly affectionate with hugs towards her other schoolmates. Teacher D prevented other kids in class from ridiculing and tormenting Layla from when she was 4 years of age up until she was 7. Layla is a highly functional person with Asperger syndrome. Teacher D saw that she would be able to diminish it so that it wouldn't have to be entered into Layla's permanent school records. When Layla thinks of whom she is inspired by and strives to be like, it is the example of Teacher D. Her inspirational altruism gave Layla the resilience to continue to go to school and be positive in her fighting to make real her dreams. Teacher D stood up for and advocated for Layla, and that in turn empowered Layla to have the confidence to continually keep going to class every day to acquire a passion to keep learning. She thinks Teacher D is the reason she was capable of be being a valedictorian in high school and was able to achieve and collect two Bachelor of Arts degrees and a master's degree from attending and studying in college. When Layla was in college at age 24, she fell into a suicidal depression, wishing she were dead, remembering Cedric and what he did to her. There was no escape. She didn't have anything to fall back upon as a source of inner strength to help her out inside of herself. Throughout the years of her young and adult life, she had been raped repeatedly. This had taken a heavy toll upon her. During the day, at unpredictable times, her whole body would physically shut down and she would become numb and frozen emotionally. What she did was to seek out help by making an appointment with a college counselor. She chose a willingness to be vulnerable by confiding in him what Cedric and others did to her and the awful feelings and thoughts that she was experiencing in her present day. She felt she could take a risk to trust the school counselor wholeheartedly. This was the first time she told the whole truth of what she had experienced and suffered back then and how it was affecting her in an ill way in the near present. She never thought it was a big deal until the counselor convinced her otherwise. She unburdened herself to him. He was a beautiful man to Layla. He helped her to perceive the cause and effect of a spiritual insanity that she was infected with because of Cedric. He aided her to connect her drug addiction to the spiritual trauma and horrors that had been inflicted upon her spirit by Cedric for such a lengthy time in her childhood. Through no fault of her own, Cedric deliberately and ruthlessly perpetrated evil and criminal acts upon her living soul and childhood being. He sought to spoil and ruin her innocence and liveliness of being a child. The spiritual insanity and illness she still felt and carries over into her present day were strangling the life and spirit out of her being. This school counselor was the first human being who believed her. He showed and shared compassion, empathy, and care towards Layla for what she had suffered and for the living nightmare she was still trying to persevere through. The counselor gave all of himself to her in a way of goodness and virtue without demanding of anything from himself from her, without demanding anything for himself from her. A brightening of a gentle light within Layla began to come into being within her. Jonas, Layla's husband and father of their two children, suffered a traumatic brain injury as a direct result of his heavy drinking. He was jumping out in front of other cars because he thought it was funny. He was hit and had to have emergency brain surgery to remove a portion of his brain. He recovered and has since not drunk again. He changed his behaviors and the direction of his life. He has been a powerful example, along with being a tremendous inspiration and influence for Layla entering recovery herself. She has not drunk or done any mind altering drugs for almost 3 years and has become an active participant in her recovery program. She is supportive and encouraging of both new and older members who are in recovery too. Layla chose to be an actress, beginning in small theater productions. At 19, she was fortunate enough to join and be a part of the cast of the Broadway production Mamma Mia in New York City for 3 years. For Layla, being an actress back then and in the present means being able to leave her personal self and identity behind. She becomes someone she knows whom no one else knows exists. She pours body and soul into her role and work. She loves it. She has two children, a girl 4 and a boy 5. She loves them dearly. She is thankful for the miracle of existence and of inner light and being that both of them are in her life. They show her warmth and affection by keeping her accountable, by asking her at times to let them taste her coffee, to see that there is only coffee in her cup and not alcohol. She approves. They reflect inner beauty outwardly into the world and into Layla's soul. They have breathed a life of well being of spirit into Layla. Part of her inner strength and faith is a trust in following and practicing her program of recovery. It is one of humility, brotherly love, and being of service. She has been able to fulfill the promise of a brightening inner light by being spiritually alive. She is accomplished being she i- is accomplishing being a human and spiritual being of a higher good to her fellow man and woman. Chapter 17. Aj's narrative. Aj was born in 1988. He is 33. He is 30 years old. He came into this world as a blue baby, which meant that the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, lessening the amount of oxygen he was receiving. He is unsure whether this affected the physical development around his genitalia. He was mistaken for a female. His mother called him Audria. At the age of 3, his genitalia, the scrotum, testicles, and penis, descended from the gash between his legs. This startled and frightened him. He went and spoke to his mother. Referring to his penis, he asked her, "Should I cut this snake off with a scissors?" She told him no. She and her husband, Aj's adoptive father, continued to treat him as if he were a girl. Aj has felt throughout his life from the very beginning that he was always a boy and a male. He never felt that he was a female. His mom said to him, "You are a boy, we can treat you. If you are a boy, we can treat you as a boy." Aj felt embarrassed and uncomfortable. He needed and wanted the affection, love, and care of his parents. He didn't want to be seen as an inconvenience to them or for anyone. He had no words to explain himself. He kept silent. After this conversation, when he was in bed that night, he pushed his testicles back into his body. This was painful. It made a hole where before there hadn't been one. He used his index finger to make a gash. He made the gash deeper and wider. Looking back, Aj believed his behavior was detrimental to both his physical and mental health. When he was 6 years old, his genitalia descended again from the gash between his legs. It was extremely painful pushing his genitalia back into his body. When he turned 9, his genitalia descended again. It started to do this every day from then on, in spite of Aj's pressing it back into his body every single time. It was extraordinarily painful. He blocked out all the physical pain because he felt that he was performing an action upon his body that he should be doing. He didn't want to be ostracized or be different from anyone. Above all else, he wanted to be worthy of other people's feelings in a way of affection and care. Mostly everybody called him Aj, including his parents. When the teachers or someone called him Audria, he would tell them his name was Aj, and that was usually okay by them. When he went to school, he was referred to as a she by his school peers and teachers. He felt dishonest. He saw himself as part of a conspiracy of being someone who was supposed to lie and not tell the truth to anyone that he was a boy and not a girl. At home, his mother and father continually referred to him as a girl and a she, though they called him Aj. They forced him to wear dresses and feminine attire. Though Aj complied with their desires, inside himself he knew he was a boy. There was no confusion in spite of what he was thought of and made reference to by his schoolmates, teachers, and parents. At 12, he began to dream and fantasize of being 18. He would be strong both inwardly and outwardly. He would stand up for himself and speak the truth to others if they called him a girl or a she. He was a man. He would imagine himself when he grew up looking like the brawny man, as seen advertised on the packaging of the paper rolls, of the paper towels in the grocery stores. His favorite cartoon character was Sonic the Hedgehog, who were who wore boys' socks and shoes. He had supersonic speed, enough to run away and escape from living in his household. He liked his sister, Lucy, who was 2 years older. She treated him as a little brother and a confidant. She would talk to him constantly, yet she still referred to him as a girl. Aj had a girl cousin who was the same age as him. When he would fantasize and dream of romance from an early age on up, his romantic dreams would always be of her. On Halloween, he got a male period. Blood came out of the gash, though he continually pushed back in the male genitalia when it came out. Nevertheless, usually once a month, his body began to have a male period. He felt annoyed and viewed this happening as a shortcoming and a failing on his part. He was to blame. He felt helpless and saw his body as betraying him. He was a boy, not a girl. He was brought up to be a Catholic. Every Sunday when he went to church, he was forced to wear a dress. He felt the need to go to confession to speak the truth, to say he was a male and not a female. The priest counseled him to say 3 Hail Marys and to continue to come to confession and church. I felt totally inadequate and traumatized. He attended public school. He began to think and obsess about what was on his birth certificate. He wanted it to refer to him as a male and not a female. He began to feel afraid all the time. Aj thought maybe being born a blue baby damaged him neurologically by making him vulnerable and being preyed upon by excessive fears. As a trembling shadow, fear stalked him throughout his day. He began to experience his unconscious no experience his consciousness and being as a living nightmare without end. Depression and unhappiness overwhelmed him. He was a failure at living life. He blamed himself. He embraced isolation and solitude. He thought his only hope was surgery to make him normal as a boy. He watched lots of TV. He related to characters who were big, strong black men. If they were him, they would be lions speaking the real truth in public and in his household. They would not be cowards. They would be brave. They wouldn't call him Audria or a she or a her. Aj was a he and a him. He yearned for a courage and an inner strength to tell others, including his parents, that he was Aj, a boy, and not Audria, a girl. When he entered puberty, facial hair began to pop out. He was still Audria. He still wore dresses and feminine attire. He still went to the women's room to go to the bathroom. His schoolmates began to think of him as a transgender, a male trying to be perceived as a female. They thought he wanted to trick them into thinking he was a girl. Going and being in school was a horrid experience. Throughout the remainder of his high school, he allowed himself to be paired with several of the girls. He enjoyed foreplay with them, kissing, hugging, and petting. He only had sexual intercourse with one girl, and that was when he was 17. Finally, his body began to metamorphose into a masculine form. When he started going to college, he began to lose his breasts and develop pectoral muscles. He stopped wearing dresses. He started going to the men's room instead of the women's. He moved to Reno, Nevada when he was 20. Shortly thereafter, he had a romantic crush on a young woman who was his girlfriend for a while. Yet she chose to reject him and to end their relationship. He felt despondent. He had several drinks of alcohol, and then he got in his car and went on a speed drive along the outskirts of the city. The road led upwards towards the mountains. He knew of several places along the road above where it curled along a couple of steep cliffs. He thought of the end of his life and didn't think of it as a loss. He felt useless and that he was being forced to be alive. He accelerated with the speed he accelerated the speed of the car. He wanted to run the car off of the road. He wanted to run the car off the road when he got to one of the cliffs and to wreck it and end his life altogether. He cut off a highway patrol car. The officer sped up to him and stopped him. He got out of his patrol car and walked up to Aj's driver's window. He smelled the alcohol on Aj. He told Aj that he had been just going to give him a warning and then let him be on his way, but the alcohol changed everything. Aj got his first DUI. He was 22. With the passing of time, Aj wanted surgery to repair his genitalia. He was a man. He wasn't a woman named Audria. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would take out his birth certificate and stare at it wishfully and hope that magically on it, under gender, the F would change to M. When he fixed his gaze intently upon it long enough and hoped with all his might within his body and soul, then it would change to M. It would only be for a few seconds, and then it would revert back to F. At 27, Aj got his second DUI. He was given a choice. He could go to jail for several months, or he could enter one of the court's diversion programs. The court program would entail a willingness and commitment on his part to enter into intensive therapy and counseling sessions. Their program would last about a year. He decided to give this court program a try. Inadvertently, he was becoming aware that he was self-destructive. He was sabotaging his hopes and dreams by not completing his college classes and by also being unable to form and develop healthy, constructive relationships with his fellow man and woman. He wanted change in a positive way and attempting to live his life. He felt he needed and wanted the support of others in getting his birth certificate corrected from being a female to a male. He wanted the truth to be told that he was a male, and he wanted his birth certificate to reflect that truth. Though through the court program, he began to focus more on growing and developing his positive attributes. He continued doing civic service, volunteer work in the community. He volunteered his time in both PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and the Humane Society. He was a service coordinator for 2 dual recovery meetings for people with addictions and emotional and/or mental disorders. Also, he would walk around certain sections of the city with a trash picker-upper and bag. He would pick up the discarded debris that was littering the sidewalks. He made the environment and community a better, cleaner-looking place for everyone. I'll be right back. I gotta pee. It's like medically severe level. Gotta go pee. He successfully completed the court program after a year and a half. Presently, he hopes he will continue to be oriented to stay on this path of life-affirming experiences. Most importantly, Aj desires in a meaningful way of a higher truth and good to fulfill the time of his day and life as a man, a human being, and a living soul. He desires to remain connected to the outside world by expressing his innermost being and spirit in it. Epilogue. Dear reader, for approximately the past 25 years, I have been a volunteer worker in various recovery programs and civic organizations. In February of 2018, I received 2 awards from the special courts at Reno, Nevada Municipal Court. One was for my service work for 4 years for court clients in recovery from either drugs or alcohol, and for establishing and leading the first dual recovery anonymous program for specialty courts. The second one for my service achievements, All Rise, was from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. I experienced over 1,000 beatings from my father. Afterwards, I would be crying and weeping into my pillow while lying on my bed. I would fantasize another world in another time of imaginary people to give me hope, to want to hang on for a life to have worth living in a remote, obscure future. It was you, or someone such as you, whom I thought of as the real human being, not my father. What a wonderful, beautiful human being you are. What was most important to me was that I survived my father and what he was doing to me. I hoped the day would come and I would be free of him and whatever he was about. I hoped for one day to have the honor and privilege of making the acquaintance of people such as you. I knew intuitively, whatever you were about, that you were not like my father. I hope to live up to a noble, honorable ideal of practicing civility to be worthy of your friendship and acquaintanceship. I knew that being with people such as you would be more real, meaningful, and true than anything that was occurring during my present day back then. I humbly thank you from within my heart, spirit, and being for your inspiration in the writing of this book. Bill Neely. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this entire book. It's been really hard to read it out loud, but worth it. Not only because I did what I said I was going to do, but because now I can listen to it too. And I'm better at audio books than reading, obviously, especially out loud, because it makes you get tired in the voice. I don't know if you're not really much of a talker, such as myself. If talking doesn't energize you, but it actually makes you more tired, then this has all been worth it anyways, which it has for me for at least one time. Anyways, I hope you enjoy your week and month and year, and thank you and have a great day. Bye now.